patient while we worked out a few issues. Looks like folks are coming in. I really appreciate your patience and bearing with us. This will be the summer 2021 version of authenticating users in JavaScript apps with MSAL.js. We did this about a year ago, and the recording has been one of our most popular videos on our YouTube channel. So if you're watching this version, you're watching the most up-to-date version of the recording. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our instructor, Sydney Andrews.
Well, thanks, Matt, for the warm introduction. Hey, everyone. Thank you again for your patience as we resolve technical issues in real time, which if you're on the dev side, you know exactly what that means. And we were able to figure things out and get everything going. So today is going to be the first part of a 4-part series into developing JavaScript applications with the Microsoft Identity Platform. Really excited to share with you some of the really cool things we can do with the Microsoft Identity Platform. I've done a lot of talks and training about it from both the .NET developer side and JavaScript side. So it's kind of cool to show a single platform that can be used from developers of all backgrounds. So we're starting a little late, so I'm going to just breeze through the introductory part. I'm Sydney Andrews. I'm an Azure MVP and a Microsoft Certified Trainer. I will be providing you lots of demos and lots of content today. If anytime you want to pull that content online, just go to github.com, MSUSDev, Microsoft Identity Platform Dev. And I'm pretty sure Max has already posted that link as an announcement in the Q&A. So if you haven't seen that, that's in the Q&A. If you have questions, please post those questions in Q&A. We will try to answer those in real time, but we are all human. We're going to miss a couple questions. You're going to come up with questions after this session. Maybe you come up with questions in the session. I don't give you an answer that you feel like is deep enough or thorough enough. MSUSDev@Microsoft.com. Once again, that's MSUSDev@Microsoft.com. That's our email. Feel free to wear it out. Send us all the questions you have. If we can't get you an answer, we'll get you to the right person with an answer. Like I said, I'm going to breeze through the introduction because I really want to get into the content. This is a 4-part series. Today, we're going to talk about how we can authenticate users from a JavaScript application using the MSAL.js library. After that, we'll use that information to use the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, and that builds upon what MSAL.js does and gives us even more functionality features. Then we'll talk about how we can use the MSAL.js library to authenticate us to different services in Azure. So not just logging the user in and seeing their profile information, but connecting to various Azure services using Azure AD for role-based access control and for the actual credentials to get data plane access. Excuse me. Tripped up over my words. Using our Azure AD credentials for both data plane and control plane access to different data storage services. And then finally, we'll talk about the Graph SDK for JavaScript. If you really like some of the graph demos we show, there's a really nice library available for JavaScript for the Graph SDK that just makes it even easier to work with it. So everything from sessions 2 through 4 is going to build upon what we learned today. So today, we're really going to double click and focus on what is the Microsoft Identity Platform. And we're going to do one of my personally favorite things is manually authenticating to the Microsoft Identity Platform. So using a tool like Postman and just manually building these URLs and authenticating and showing that here's the meat and bones of how everything works. Then we'll introduce the MSAL.js library. And fortunately, since you would have at that point seen how to manually authenticate, the MSAL.js library will be a little bit easier for us to explain because you'll have all the underlying concepts. And then we'll just do a really simple demo at the end to tie everything together where we use the MSAL.js library to grab a token and then query the graph. And you'll have enough information to go into sessions 2 through 4 fully armed to use these really great libraries and use these really great processes and flows. So let's talk about identity development and let's talk about the Microsoft Identity Platform. 2 goals today. And I hold up 3 fingers at first, 2 goals, not 3. First, we're going to learn enough about the Microsoft Identity Platform that we can do a manual authentication. And I think this is really important that we actually authenticate to the platform at least once manually and learn all the meats and bones, learn the fundamental concepts, learn how application registrations work, all in the very manual, very predictable environment Then we'll introduce the MSAL library. That's just gonna make all of that a whole lot easier. But we'll have enough information that if something goes wrong, I have a typo, maybe you use it and you see an error code you don't really understand, you'll know enough information from doing it manually that you'll be able to debug and work with the MSAL library from a more knowledgeable perspective. So before I introduce the Microsoft Identity Platform, I like to set context. And my favorite way to set context is talking about identity as the control plane across everything you do. So what do I mean there? Well, with our modern businesses and the services you use, we have many different applications, whether it's built by our organization, it's built by a first party like Microsoft or a third party running on one of the Microsoft stacks. These applications run the gamut of things, whether they're devices that we use in a warehouse, use on a sales floor, whether they're knowledge applications that we use from our offices to track data, store data, manipulate data, fill out forms, and archive data, whether it's communicating with people, even something as simple as email, whether it's connecting to other employees, storing our organizational hierarchy, or whether we're connected to third-party services like Box.com, Salesforce, things like that. All of them have one thing in common, and that's identity. See, in a perfect world, we would use our identity to connect to everything. We get an identity as part of our joining our corporate organization, and then we use that identity for everything we need to access. So that makes identity the control plane across everything. As developers, it's kind of easy for us to say, oh, I'm not worried about the security identity stuff. But the more we learn about it, the more development we do in that space, the more we master it, that means the more capabilities we can add to applications. As we start to think about cloud native applications, distributed applications, and how we want to integrate them, it becomes critical that we absolutely nail the identity story. But I like to say that's a two-way street because Azure Active Directory, that's the premier service in Azure to manage identity, whether we're connecting to the Microsoft Cloud, whether we're connected to devices, whether they're bring your own devices when you're working from home, on-premise devices, on-premise applications, or even third-party SaaS applications. Azure Active Directory, that's that core between all of it, and it allows us to have identities in an easily managed way. And there was a story around authenticating with Azure Active Directory for a long time. And that was the ADAL library, the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. It's been around for a long time. It has its own endpoints. You can federate identity from on-premise to Azure, and then use the ADAL library to have one login story across on-premise and cloud applications. And it's one of those things where it technically worked, but the barrier of entry was really high. See, ADAL was very, very thorough. It was built for people who had a lot of background in security development. So if I went and I Googled or Binged or used whatever your preferred search engine, how to authenticate to Azure AD, and maybe I'm a JavaScript developer or Python developer, I would be sent to a sample application that's easily 300, 500 lines of code. And that's kind of rough because it causes a couple problems. One is I have no idea what in this 300, 500 line of code sample is relevant to authentication. If something breaks, I essentially have a house of cards and I don't know what component broke. I'm not sure why. And it's just really difficult to ingest and learn. So sometimes, and this has been my experience as a consultant, sometimes organizations will just skip over identity or use some type of proxy, or they try to find a way around identity because it was just too difficult to add identity to existing applications. So ADAL worked, but there was a need for something more. So along comes the Microsoft Identity Platform. And the idea here was to take some of the great things about ADAL, which is how thorough it is, how deep it is, and how it's ingrained and connected to Azure Active Directory, and make it simpler to use, make it work across all Microsoft identities, and create a single unified full stack, including libraries, sample codes, documentation, so that if I'm somebody who wants to do identity development for the first time in my career, there's a happy path for me deciding I want to log in using Azure AD accounts in my app to actually getting there, and it's not such a barrier of entry. And don't worry about this link. I'll put it in the Q&A in a second when we walk through it. So the Microsoft Identity Platform was introduced, and it created a new endpoint So the old ADAL endpoint we refer to as the 1.0 endpoint, and the new Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint is referred to as the 2.0 endpoint. Now, this great Identity 2.0 endpoint, it's a REST API, so it has HTTP API, so it's GET and POST, all the stuff you can use from any type of HTTP client, and it allows you access to your work or school accounts, which is what we already expected using Azure AD, but also other types of accounts. For example, personal accounts, so Microsoft accounts. Think about like live accounts or Xbox accounts, and then social accounts. So let's say you are having users who logged in using a social media identity, they can use those accounts to connect to your application too. So it gives you a single endpoint to connect to all these different types of identities. And it gives you a single library, the Microsoft Authentication Library, available in many popular programming languages to interact with that endpoint. Now, here's the great thing about this. The V1 ADAL endpoint is still there. If you write an application against it, you're fine. It's not deprecated, it's not going away, but this gives you, especially for new applications you want to modernize, this gives you a new endpoint with a lot of modern features. So let's look at the documentation page for MSAL. And I always like to do this because people say, hey, where can I get the documentation? And I'd really like to walk you through how to get the documentation. So the first place I'm going to go to is docs.com. That's docs.com, docs.com. And I'm going to put this as an announcement in our Q&A, docs.com. I just put that in the Q&A. Now, docs.com will take you to docs.microsoft.com, nice little redirect, which is Microsoft's landing page for all documentation. Now, you can get to Q&A and ask people in technical community questions. You can look at code samples. You can go to Microsoft Learn, do interactive hands-on labs. You can even just explore the documentation itself. We're going to do just that. So for documentation, we're going to select Azure. And somebody says, hey, is ADAL slated to be retired? Yes, ADAL is being retired. I believe there's a migration story, and I'm going to have to put a little information around the migration story. I don't think the retirement is going to break existing applications using ADAL, but I know for sure you're not recommended to use the ADAL library moving forward. So somebody asked about ADAL's retirement. I'm going to have to go double check that. That was what I read the last time, but my information could be absolutely out of date because I've been using identity platform for so long that I haven't really been tracking ADAL like it used to. All right, so we're at the Azure documentation page. And from here, I'm going to go to identity. So that's identity. And then I'm going to select Azure Active Directory. This is going to take me to the overview or landing page for all of Azure Active Directory's documentation. So how to configure Azure AD, how to create users, how to register applications, all the fun stuff with Azure AD. But if you scroll down, you'll see that there's different categories. One of them is called Microsoft Identity Platform. And if you select About Microsoft Identity Platform, this will take you to the documentation page to introduce the identity platform. So a lot of concepts I'm going to talk to you about today are on this documentation page. And what I like to do for everyone is I like to put this as an announcement in the Q&A. There we go. So that you can go to this documentation page on your own speed when you feel like you want to review this again. Now, just in case you're interested, there's also a landing page for Microsoft Identity Platform with lots of video learning, sample code, sample applications, some explanations of different concepts that are not specific to Microsoft, but will be talked about quite a bit when you're using Microsoft Identity Platform, and even information about Microsoft Graph. Now, from here, let's go back to our presentation. And I want to talk about what we're going to do today, and that's authenticating to Microsoft manually. And somebody actually just pulled up the documentation page and shared with the community. I'm going to publish this to Q&A, the active retirement information for ADAL. And I apologize for not being as up to speed on that as I should have been. I'm going to make sure in future webinars that I share this information more accurately. So I apologize for being a little bit incorrect, but ADAL is slated to be retired in a little bit less than a year. The last time I looked into it, I didn't know the retirement date. So thank you so much for the individual who shared that information. All right, so when we use the Microsoft Identity Platform, we're going to do a manual authentication. We need to understand some basic concepts. The first concept is what is an Azure Active Directory application? Well, Azure Active Directory requires us to tell it when we're going to use it to authenticate our applications. And the way we do that is we can register applications with Azure Active Directory. Now, this gives us access to authentication workflows and gives us access to different tokens. And the great thing about this is by registering these applications to Azure Active Directory, you can manage them, manage what type of access is allowed, manage what URLs are allowed. So for example, if you plan to use your application on a specific website and a very specific flow, you can lock down the application registration. So it only allows the things you want it to allow. And if somehow your credentials are leaked, obviously you'll refresh, update credentials as necessary, like your client secrets, but it still just minimizes your attack surface. The other advantage to managing application registrations is you could say certain applications have access to certain things. So for example, I could say application 1 has access to read all, whoever gives it consent has application to read their email, while application 2 has access to look at the list of Microsoft Teams they belong to. So application registrations are really one of the core concepts. You're going to see me go to the registration page multiple times today. Now, when you register application, typically you include a redirect URI for the application you're registering. Now, the beauty of that redirect URI is it allows you to send the user to log in and have them redirect it back to your application. And you register that redirect URI ahead of time so that your application will only send people to places you approve of. That way, you don't have a situation where you log in a user, then they forward it to some other website. You control all of that in your application registration. Now, once you register the application, you'll have different credentials and information that you can use to set up your authentication workflow. And again, we'll go into this a little bit deeper later, but there's also different types of applications you can register. So for example, you can register single page JavaScript applications. You can register more general server-side web applications. You can register APIs without an interactive login experience. You can register desktop or mobile applications. You can even register server-side jobs or what I like to call unattended applications. So let's register our first application in Azure AD. So I got my browser open. You notice I probably shouldn't have shown this. I had the Azure port open. I'm logged in using an account to my own Azure AD directory. So if I select Azure Active Directory, it's going to take me to my directory. Now from here, I can add an application registration. I'm going to select Add App Registration. Now, if you're not the owner of your directory, which this user I'm logged in is not, you can actually go into role-based access control and give people, and I don't want to show mine, so I'm not going to show it off, but you can give people access to be an application administrator or application developer. And those two roles will allow somebody to register applications without having full control over your Azure AD directory. So let's give this application a name, or application registration a name, excuse me. I'm going to call this example. This is my example registration. What type of accounts do I support? Well, I can support only accounts in my current directory. So right now, this is the directory I'm in. I can support accounts at any organization, as long as they're Azure AD organization, still organization native accounts. So that's a multi-tenant. I'm going to select multi-tenant. There's a couple others. Like for example, I can support multi-tenant organizations and personal Microsoft accounts. So think like Skype or Xbox, or I could just support personal Microsoft accounts only. Well, today I'm going to keep it simple. Only Azure AD accounts, and they have to be native to Azure AD, so not personal accounts, or what we call consumer accounts. There's also a nice Help Me Choose link if you're not familiar with these terms and you want to read the documentation on them. Now, you don't have to select a redirect URI at this point, but we're going to go ahead and do that. This allows us to tell the application registration that when we authenticate, where to send the user back to. So we're going to do a manual authentication. So just for fun, I'm going to send the user back to localhost. I'm going to create a mobile or desktop application, and I'm going to say HTTP localhost. That's where we're redirecting back to. Just super simple, nothing complex here. I'm going to hit register, and it's creating my application registration with a whole bunch of credentials that I'll make sure to clean up and delete later. Now, the beauty about this is I have some permissions already set up. So if I go to API permissions here, I'll see that by default, this application registration has the permission to read a user's profile from Microsoft Graph. I can always go and add additional permissions, wherever they're to Azure services or to the Microsoft Graph. For example, I might want to add an application permission to, I don't know, read or write to your calendar. Somebody says, hey, this MSAL stuff, does that support Azure AD B2C? Yes, absolutely. On that documentation page I sent you to, Azure AD B2C scenarios are called out very specifically because, again, one unified library, one unified workflow for all authentication against Azure. All right, so we have our application registration. Everything looks good. It's already have permission to read the user information. If we go to authentication, we can see that we have a mobile desktop application. It has some built-in redirect URIs we can select, but I just put in localhost to keep things simple. And we support accounts in any organizational directory. Super simple, super clean. That's literally all I'm going to do right now. Now, let's actually talk about authenticating. See, there's many different ways we can authenticate. We'll go into this much deeper in later sessions in this series, but just, off the bat, I just want to talk about some of the most common examples. So for example, we can do an interactive authentication flow. So for example, when we have a user, they go to our website and we want them to log in, we can either send them doing a redirect, or we can open a pop-up to log in to Azure AD. That's the interactive component. And then Azure AD does the redirect back or send the information back that we're going to use to access the various services. We can use the integrated Windows authentication. So if we know we're on domain joined devices and we want to use Windows, we can do that. We can do a device code. That one's pretty cool. What that allows us to do is, so let's say we're in an unattended scenario, we can actually have the device, or not unattended, but headless, or a scenario where we can't type or interact with a browser on a device. We have the device give us a code and use another device. So maybe we're working on an IoT board and it gives us a 6-digit code that we use our phone and that 6-digit code to log in. There's a couple other flows, but those are the ones I want to really focus on because those are the ones we're going to walk through throughout this series. So the flow we're going to use today is the interactive authentication flow. So we're going to have an application. We're going to do this manually first and then using a browser second. We're going to take this application. We're going to go to Azure AD. The user is going to log in. Azure AD is going to send back, based upon our scopes, the information required to access the services we want to access. And then we're going to go directly to that services with that information that's required. I'm being very vague here because we haven't quite introduced that concept yet. Now, somebody asks, hey, you said something about redirect URI. Where does that fit in here? Well, when we go, and let me open up the pen here. We go from our application to Azure AD. Azure AD needs to know where to go back. So today for our manual flow, we just put in localhost. So when we go to the application to Azure AD, we're going to tell Azure AD, when you're done, redirect to localhost. The first thing Azure AD is going to do is double check that localhost is one of the allowed redirect URIs for application registration. You saw that when I registered the application, I said, yeah, allow localhost. So once it says, okay, localhost is allowed, it's going to show the login page. The user is going to log in, and then it's going to redirect back to localhost. Then our application can take the information from there and go to the service of our choice. There's a couple other flows we can do, and I got a couple good questions. We're going to come back to these questions a little bit later. One of my favorite ones is the device code flow. This allows us to take our application and say, okay, we can't interact with this application, but this application can show the user information. So think about maybe a console application running server side, or maybe an IoT board, or maybe even a TV screen. You've actually seen a device code flow if you use a modern video streaming application. It says, okay, use your phone to log in with this code. That's the device code flow. So the application shows some code, and the user uses another device. We're just saying a workstation. They're using a desktop PC here, and they're going to log into Azure AD using that device. Once the login happens, Azure AD is going to send that information back to the application, and then the application can access the service. Again, there's other flows. Let's see. Test loads to pointer off. But these are the ones I want to double down on because we're going to show these in demos. So when we log in, we actually have to send the user to a specific URL. And the really great thing here is that, I don't know why my pen's not working today, but that's okay, is that you've probably seen this URL before when you logged into the Azure portal, login.microsoftonline.com. You've probably seen this URL for many different things you logged in using your native organizational account. The way this URL works is that we have login.microsoftonline.com. We pass in some tenant identifier, which we'll talk about more in a second. And then we go to the OAuth 2 endpoint, v2.0 for the Microsoft Identity Platform. Remember, ADAO 1.0, Microsoft Identity Platform is 2.0. Now, there's two relative URLs. One is the login, that's the authorized URL. And then if we need to acquire a token to access a different service, that's the token URL. So let's talk about that special tenant identifier. Now, you can pass in the GUID that identifies your tenant. So for example, my organization has a unique GUID for that tenant ID, or you could pass in 3 keywords. Organization says, hey, you can log into any organizational account from any organization Azure AD. Consumer says, hey, you can log into any consumer account, any generic consumer account. And then common says, you can log into either or organizational account or a consumer's account. So now that I called it out a couple times when you log into portals, you're going to notice it's going to say organizations, consumers, or common, or it might have the GUID. And the cool thing about it is if you do things like pass in the GUID for your organization, then when the user gets to the login screen, it's already branded to your experience because they know based upon the URL that you're specifically logging into this organization. You may have had the experience where you go to a login screen and it's just very generic. And then as soon as you type in your email, the next login page looks way more specific and branded to your organization. At that point in time, they might be using the organization's keyword, and we know you're going to some Azure AD organization, but we don't know which one yet. So it's really cool how you can use either a unique GUID or a keyword to influence the login workflow for the user. So if we wanted to authorize with Azure Active Directory and want to use OAuth 2.0, here's how we do it. We go to loginmicrosoftonline.com. We pass in our unique tenant identifier, OAuth 2 version 2.0. We'll go to that authorized endpoint. That's that authorized relative URL. We pass in our client ID. That's one of the things we got when we register our application. We tell it what type of response we want. I want a code that I can use to go get my token, so I'll just set it to code today. We need to tell it what redirect URI. Where do you go after we log in? So we'll specify redirect URI at that point in time. We will set the scope. So what permissions do we want? We only have one permission set up, so that was user.read. And then we'll set a response mode. We can either do form post, so we do a post back, or a query where there's a GET request back. It puts the code information in the query string instead of the body, as in a form post. For fun, we can also specify the state value. This allows us to put some type of sanity check there that we can validate when we get our redirect back to make sure that we're lining up the right login with the right response. Once we have that URL, we go to our browser and log in, and then we look at the response. And I have a couple slides, and again, Matt and I, we put the URL up if you wanted to look through these slides. But what I think, because we started a little late, I'm going to do something a little wacky. I'm going to just go in and show you how this works manually. And you know what? This might work, this might not, but we're going to have some fun. So we're going to go to a tool. I like to use Postman for this, but you can use any tool you like. I just like Postman. I'm going to create a new GET request. I'm going to say HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com/. Now I can pass in the GUID for my tenant if I want to lock it down to just my tenant. I can pass in common. I can pass in organizations. I can pass in lots of different things. I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to pass in the GUID for my tenant. That's a tongue twister for me. So my directory ID, I'm going to copy that to clipboard. Go in here, pass that in. I'm going to go to the OAuth 2 version 2.0 that gets us to the Microsoft Identity Platform, HTTP endpoints, and we're going to go to the relative authorized URL. Now remember, we need to pass in a couple things. The first one was client ID. I'm going to go back to my application registration. I'm going to copy that client ID from here. So just copy that. Go back to Postman, paste that in. Going to get a couple more values and just checking my notes to make sure I don't forget anything. The first one I want to paste in is response type. Or not paste, I'm typing in. I want a code after I log in. Now, how do I want to get that code? Do I want to get a form post or do I want to get a query? I want you to just give it in the query string. Now, where should Azure AD redirect to? Well, we configured it for localhost, so that's why I'll pass in for my redirect URI. And then the final thing is scope. What permissions do I want? Well, we're going to do just user.read. And just for fun, I'm going to pass in a state. This webinar is awesome. That's going to be my state value. So I have everything pasted in. And one of the cool things about Postman is it'll build your long URL for you. So you don't have to memorize the whole syntax and how to do that. So I'm going to just copy this nice long URL. I'll open a new browser tab and paste it in. Hit enter. And there we go. A couple things happened here. Because I used my GUID for my organization, it skipped the generic Microsoft login screen and went right to my organization's login screen. And since this is the authorized endpoint, I need to go ahead and log in. So I'm gonna just log in real quick. This is my first time accessing this application. It says, hey, user, this application has requested permission to read your profile. Now, this application is unverified. What that means is I haven't verified my publisher information. I just created this application registration today. So it's giving me a heads up. Hey, we don't know who this person is. This asking for permission. So just, be aware of that. I created this application registration, so I'm not worried. I will hit accept. And something really cool happens. It redirects me back to localhost with a whole bunch of information on their query string. Let's cut that and close that tab. Let's go into Postman and look at what we have. So one of the cool things about Postman is you can paste your URL back into this get field and it will parse it for you. So there's our state. This webinar is awesome. So that's how I validate that this response matched the request I created earlier. And one of the cool things here is it gave me a code. This code proves that I'm authenticated and I can pass this code to our token endpoint in order for me to get a bearer token that I can use the excuse me, that I can use to get my token. Somebody asked if I could run through this with my incognito window. I use passwordless login. So one of the downsides is I don't have my phone on live shows, and I would need my phone to log in. There's a recording of this session on YouTube already where I do exactly that. I'll run through this login experience using a different account and incognito window. And I'm sure Matt has the link to that on YouTube. But the last time we did this session, we did it on YouTube, and we specifically showed how to do it in an incognito window. So definitely want to make sure you get to see that. All right, so now that we've done that, we need to go get a token that we can use to access services. So we're going to go get a bearer token. The way we do that is we're going to go to HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com. And instead of comment, I'm going to go ahead and reuse my GUID feed from here. There we go. Passing my GUID for my organization. OAuth. Got to spell that correctly. OAuth 2, version 2.0. But instead of authorized, this time we're going to go to the token endpoint. Instead of a GET request, we're going to do a POST request. Going to select body and pass in some form data for this POST request. Now, the cool thing about this POST request is a lot of the values that we need to fill out are the same. So client ID is going to be the ID for application registration. So go back to the Azure portal, grab my client ID one more time, paste that in. Code. What code did I get previously? Well, let's go into Postman. Here's that really long code I got. So I'm going to select all and copy it and paste it in. Now from here, I need to specify my redirect URI. That's still going to be localhost. And I need to specify, I believe, scope. That's going to be user.read. The only unique thing I need to specify in this form body is the grant type. Okay, token endpoint. What do I want? Well, I want an authorization code that I can use as a bearer token to access various Azure services. So I'm going to type in authorization code. And just for everyone's information, those links Matt shared earlier, that gets you to our GitHub repo. Every single demo I'm showing you right now, every single slide I'm showing you is live on our GitHub repo, so you can walk through it and see all the exact things I'm showing you line for line. I hit send. If I got no typos, my body of my response has a bearer token that has the ability to use to read my profile. And there's my bearer token. So really fun stuff. So let's just go ahead and copy my bearer token. Now, where can I use that bearer token? Well, one example we're going to use today is we're going to use the Microsoft Graph. If you've never been to the Graph Explorer before, it's aka.ms/ge. I'm going to go ahead and put that as an announcement in the Q&A, aka.ms/ge. And from here, this is the Graph Explorer. We can use it to explore the graph, test queries out. So the default query that's built in is graph.microsoft.com's version 1.0/me, and that gets your profile information. So I'm not logged in. It's going to use a sample user. So I'm just running a query. And the sample user is just there so you can do some simple queries, has some profile information. But just in case I'm interested, I can log in using my account. So I hit sign in to Graph Explorer. I'm going to select my account. It's going to say, hey, you need to get Graph Explorer permission to access your account. Sure, hit accept. And now I'm going to run the same query using my account. You'll see Sydney Andrews and then my email. So definitely able to use the graph to query some common identities. And the way we did this is we authenticated, as you saw with that login pop-up, we authenticated to Azure. So going back to Postman, we've already done authentication part. We already have our bearer token. So I should just be able to do a GET request, https graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me. And the only thing I need to do is create, and I can create this manually automatically. I create a bearer token header. I already have some values. I'll paste in my new bearer token. And if you want to create it manually, you just use authorization header, has the word bearer, a space. There we go. And then our bearer token. That's how you would do it manually. Hit send. And there you go. There's my profile information. So really cool stuff. I'm able to jump in and get my profile information manually. So we did a manual authentication. We went to the login page. The user logged in. If they haven't already, they gave consent to the application. Then we use that login information, that login code we got from Azure AD to go to the token endpoint to get a bearer token that gives us access to other services in Azure. So think of that bearer token is almost like gives us the keys to the rest of the Azure kingdom. Since we only requested user.read as our scope, we only have permission to read our profile information from the graph. So we went to graph.microsoft.com, issued an HTTP GET request using our bearer token, remember our key to the kingdom, and that allowed us to read the profile information. And again, since we started a little bit late, I want to take this and I want to run this directly into example application. So I said we were going to authenticate manually first, and then we're going to do the same thing using code. So I have Visual Studio Code open, and I have it open to empty folder. Now I'm going to go to github.com. So let me just find a space to do this. github.com/msusdev. Go to repositories, and there's an example static JS app. I'm going to put this link in the Q&A for anybody who hasn't seen it. And it's just a really, really simple JavaScript application. Matter of fact, let me just go ahead and clone this. So copy the URL. I have Windows Terminal open in this folder. So git clone, paste in that URL, and clone it to the current folder by using dot, hit enter. I would go back to my application. There's my really simple Node application. It has a package.json file that has HTTP server as a dev dependency. Has an index.html file that has the CSS for Bootstrap and just some Bootstrap stuff. There's an index.js file that when we click the run button, run code button, it just logs running to the console. Nothing crazy here. Let's just test it out real quick. So we'll type in npm start. Uh-oh, I forgot to run npm install. I do this every time. npm install to install the HTTP server dependency. Uh-oh, let's see. Got an error message. Let's try that one more time. npm install. There we go. I've never seen that happen before. And then npm start. All right, it started our server. So if I got everything right, I should be able to control click. And it's opened the web application in my browser. Super simple web application. I'm going to open up developer console, hit run code, and it'll just print running. That's it. That's all it does right now. Now I want to use the MSAL.js library. So I'm going to post a link in the Q&A chat for the MSAL.js library. And I'm going to go there. Here we go. Just open this GitHub, go to Microsoft Authentication Library for JS, and we'll see that this is the GitHub repo for the MSAL.js library. We can do all sorts of cool things, learn about the library, learn how to use it in Node applications. It has Angular variant. I believe it has a React variant, all sorts of cool things. So it's really cool to have that MSAL.js library. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and implement it. So before somebody says something, just for simplicity's sake, and to keep these demos nice and concise, just to teach us the basic concepts, I'm going to start with the simpler to parse MSAL.js 1.0 library. But in demos that we do later on in this series, we're going to use the MSAL.js 2.0 library. So it's just I'm just using an older version of MSAL.js library because it makes it really simple for us to see what's running in our code. So that library is hosted on a Microsoft CDN. I'm going to just go ahead and paste that URL in. So this is the MSAL.js library. I'm not using the flattened version, or I'm not using the minified version. Just using a really simple, easy to read, more fleshed out version. I'm going to add this to my JavaScript application. So I'm going to go to index.html. Going to add a script tag. Script type text JavaScript. Just got to learn how to spell JavaScript today. Source equals, I'm pasting that source and close my script tag. That's all I need to do to this HTML file. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and write my code for MSAL.js library. So the first thing we need to do is we need to call the MSAL.js library by doing new MSAL, and the IntelliSense not really that helpful because we are just doing we're importing JavaScript file in a separate HTML file. If you're doing like an Angular React application, you use import statements, you'll have really good IntelliSense here. I'm just doing it very manually because I don't want any demo magic. I want everybody to see very clearly what I'm doing. So MSAL.userAgent application creates a new application that we can use to access Azure AD using the Microsoft Identity Platform. We need to pass in some configuration information, so we'll do just that. We'll say const config equals. We'll create a little simple object. It's going to have an auth property, and that auth property is going to have 3 properties I care about: my client ID, my authority, my redirect URI. Now, 2 of these you could probably guess. My redirect URI is HTTP localhost. And remember, this web application that's running locally is running on port 8080. So localhost 8080. My client ID is going to be the same client ID for my application registration. So I'll go back to my application registration and copy my client ID for maybe the umpteenth time and paste that in. The only new one is authority. Luckily for us, authority, you've seen this before. It's HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com/ and then the name of our tenant. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just put organizations here. And this will allow me to use any Azure AD account, not just ones in my tenant. Now, if I wanted to, I can run this right now, but I'm going to run into a problem. This is a web application, and I only have registered, excuse me, I only registered my mobile desktop application. So I need to create a new application registration. So I'll go to Authentication within my application, excuse me, not a new application registration. I need to create a new platform, and I only have the mobile desktop platform. And I apologize for twisting my words here. I'm going to add a new platform called Web. I'm going to say my redirect URL for this platform is HTTP localhost 8080. And since this is a client-side application, I'm going to allow it to issue tokens directly from the authorization endpoint. So there's my localhost 8080 redirect URI for our web application, and it implicitly allows us to issue tokens directly from the authorization endpoint. So let's finish up the rest of our code. We're going to go in here. We're going to put this in a variable called client, so we can use it later. We're going to call client.login popup. Now, login popup allows us to pass in a scope, so we will just let's say create a variable called options, scopes, user.read. So very similar to what we were doing with that query string, just a little bit different syntax. Login popup is asynchronous, so we'll await it. You can also use promises and stuff here, but that's perfectly fine for me. Let login response equals the results of await client login popup, and then we'll console.dir login response. So if I don't have any typos, I should just be able to control F5 or run this immediately. So let's go in to my application, control F5. All right, moment of truth. Run code. Just gonna do my login pop-up. Gonna log in as, notice it doesn't have my branding because it doesn't know what tenant. I just put organization, so it's any organization. I'm gonna log as my own account. It's going to say, hey, this application needs permission to read your profile. Sure. Accept. And it redirected me back to localhost 8080. So let's make sure I don't have a typo here. Run code. I'm not 100% sure why my pop-up. I've never seen this before. My pop-up is just redirecting right here. And let's see. Oh, I know what's going on. Let's do localhost 8080 here. My browser is smarter than me. Hit run code. There we go. It redirected me back. For those who didn't realize what happened, since my browser said 127.0.0.1 8080, when it redirected back to localhost 8080, my browser assumed that was a different URL, so it kept me in the pop-up. Super weird. But I didn't know that was a thing. I've never seen that before. But now, since it said localhost 8080, I logged in, everything looks good. I hit object, and there's my account information. So we are cooking. I can use the library to go in and get a token. So let's do that. And got some questions. I'm going to answer them as soon as I'm done with this demo. I'm just moving a little bit faster than normal to make up for some lost time. So we're going to create a token response variable, and we're going to call client.acquire token silent. From that request, we'll pass in the same options. And then we're going to console.dir our token response. This is going to look very similar to what we did when we did our manual authentication. So the first thing we did was we authenticated. We had that first object, which is the results of us authenticating through the pop-up. That pop-up showed and hit itself very fast. And then the second thing we did is go to the token endpoint to get our access token, which is right here. And we can use that token to access different different Azure services. And we're going to do the exact same thing we did last time, which is access the graph. And we're going to keep it really simple. We're going to call fetch HTTPS graph. Spell graph correctly. Graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me. I'm going to pass in. Remember I said we need some headers, so I'm going to pass in headers. My header is going to be authorization header that I showed you from within Postman. It's a bearer token, so bearer space, and then we need to pass in our token. So that's going to be a token response. And if we go back to our browser, we'll notice token response has a property called access token. So we're going to paste that. We're going to use that right here. So token response dot access token. And then let's see. I'm going to call this asynchronously. So await let payload stored result in a variable called payload. Payload has a JSON function. I'm going to await that and store that in a variable called JSON. So let JSON equals asynchronous call to payload.json, and I'm a console.dir JSON. That's all I'm gonna do. So if I did everything correctly, I should just be able to control F5, run my code, pop-up shows authorization, token, and then my call to the graph, which shows my display name, given name, mail, title, principal names, all sorts of useful information. So I was able to use the MSAL.js library to completely and perfectly do the same exact demo that I did manually. Now, today, that's where we're going to stop, because moving on from here, we're going to talk about how we can bring that MSAL.js library in more complicated ways, how we can use it with the graph, how we can use it with the graph toolkit. And I saw lots of really good questions in the chat. So I'm going to try and answer as many of these as I can. And of course, if I don't have the answer, I'm going to recommend you email us at msusdev@microsoft.com. Somebody said, hey, you added client ID and tenant ID in Node application. Do we need to secure that in some way? Because if somebody has their client ID and tenant ID, what are security issues? So yeah, if you want to secure it, you can. The kicker is, let's say somebody takes your client ID and even your tenant ID. If they don't have an account that can authenticate into that directory, they really can't do much with it. And let's say they do have an account that authenticates to that directory, you still have control of the Azure AD application registration and what redirect URIs are allowed. So that's one of the important things about setting up your redirect URI, so that other sites can't intercept requests and redirect people to the wrong place. So yeah, you can definitely protect and secure your client ID and tenant ID. You don't have to, but you can definitely do that. But if you're using credentials or client secrets, I would absolutely, without a doubt, secure those, because those will allow you to get around the whole login scenario. So there are some authentication flows that are meant for maybe, and the word eludes me right now, but application scenarios where they're done. I can't think of the word, but when you're not interacting with the applications done as a job or done in the background, in those scenarios, you might have a client secret stored, so there's no actual interactive login. Those scenarios, securing that client secret, securing those credentials of absolutely monumental importance. Somebody says, hey, the MSAL.js library, is this just a universal OAuth library, or is it really specifically tuned to Azure Active Directory? I have not tried it any other OAuth endpoints, but from what I understand, it's very specific to Azure Active Directory. Somebody says, hey, that library show, is that the entire library? So the JavaScript file I showed you, that's, if you're just using the browser side, that's the library. If you're like using a Node import, you can, there's Azure MSAL browser, and you'll see there's different flavors of it. So npm, let's see, let's go to, is it npm.org? Nope. npm.js. npm.js.com. Go to Azure MSAL browser, you see this, there's the Azure MSAL browser library, and if you go to Azure MSAL, you see there's different versions of the library and different additional libraries you can bring in. So for example, if I believe there's an Angular and React flavor, there's extensions, lots of stuff here that's gonna be really useful if you're using the MSAL library. Somebody says, hey, now, if I'm doing application registration, should I put all my redirect URIs in one application registration, or should I create different application registrations for dev, test, and prod? This is a great question to send us to msusdev@microsoft.com. So I'm not actually sure what the best practice is there. In my experience, I have actually used different applications registrations for dev, test, and prod, just because when I'm doing dev, I might have more or less application permissions that I want prod to have at this point in time. Here's an example of what I mean. Let's say we're adding a new feature to our application to read your email, and right now the application only reads your profile information. If I have an application registration for dev, I can register that API permission in dev, and nothing happens to prod. If I use one application registration for dev and prod, what will happen is as soon as I add permission for mail, read, write, and some type of code slips through or something happens where the user will be prompted to give that permission, and I might not be ready for them to get that permission yet. Now, I know that's a kind of an edge case, but that's one of the reasons I use different application registrations. Send us that question, msusdev@microsoft.com. I'm not 100% sure what the best practice is there, but that was a great question. Let's see, there's a couple questions, people coming in. Service principles. Yes, you can create a service principle, and you can, if you're doing a non-interactive scenario, you can create a client secret so you log in using a specific service principle. There's a couple different ways to do this. Somebody says, hey, MSAL with custom scopes, roles, and permissions. Do you know how to do that? Yes, we are going to go into that in one of the remaining 3 sessions. At the end of this series, we're going to talk about MSAL with different scopes, permissions, specifically different scopes and permissions necessary for Azure services. We'll even talk about custom scopes and permissions that you can use if you want to build your own. Somebody says, if we're using client ID and client secret, we probably shouldn't be using MSAL.js. There are some scenarios where you're building jobs using the node library, and you might be using client secret. But yes, if you're using client secret, I would not recommend you passing your client secret information into a single page application running client side in your user's browser. And I'm looking just to make sure. Again, there's a couple of questions I think I missed. If you feel like I didn't answer your question, just email us at msusdev@microsoft.com. I'll tell you this. We're glad you all hung in there through our technical issues. We're going to have a recording on YouTube. I'm sure you'll get the email as soon as this session is over. We already have some recordings from past versions of this session on YouTube. One of the recordings goes even deeper than I went about today. Thank you so much for your time coming in, hanging in with us through these technical issues. Lots of great questions. If you feel like I didn't answer your question, or maybe I don't have a good answer for your question, like I think somebody's using an Active Directory federated server, or I can't remember services or server. I don't have an answer for that, but email us at msusdev@microsoft.com. We'll track somebody down who does have the answer for that. But thank you again for all your time, and we hope to see you in sessions 2 through 4. We're going to take the information that we manually learned about today, our first time authenticating against the MSAL library, and we're going to use it with the Graph Toolkit, with various Azure services, and even the Graph library itself, so that we can do some really interesting and exciting scenarios in Azure. So thank you again for coming today, and Matt, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We'll go ahead and just sign off and see everyone next week.